I'd have to say we're all a product of our own experiences. And I pulled on a lot of little experiences that didn't seem important at the time. I'm one of them, surprisingly. I remember when I was about that tall. And my dad was at the dining room table, and I could see he was laboring over something that was causing him some concern. And I went up to him and I just asked him, I said, what's the problem, Dad? And he says, I'm trying to figure out how I can buy Sloan Valve Company. But he said, I just can't make the numbers work. Here's a guy who's, smart guy, but he's not sophisticated in financial planning. He was an operator, a business operator, and he just didn't know what tools he could have brought to the table to get that job done. I should also just say, and I don't want to get into this too much, but this was how the Sloans and the Allens were at Sloan Valve Company. There was major conflict. I'll get into that in just a second. I didn't know what it meant to buy the company or not to buy the company. I just knew that my dad was really stressed out about it, and it stuck with me. The next time that I remember was in 1954. I was a naval cadet during the summer program at Culver Military Academy. And my mom and dad came down just to visit, and my mom pulled me aside, and she said, I just have to tell you that the last board of directors meeting, your Uncle Jim was made president of the company, and your dad was not made president. And I remember going back to my room, and I have to admit, I really cried about that. And I cried because I knew how much my dad wanted to be president, had really kind of been groomed for the position, was a confidant at W.E. Sloan's, and it just didn't happen. And you can plan and plan and plan, but sometimes you get thrown a curveball. There was some political things that happened, and that was taken away from him. And then the next thing was, when I wanted to join the company, Jane and I, after I was working for Wheelabrator in South Bend, and Jane and I decided we'll go to New York City, just to kind of get away from the influence of the family, which was kind of domineering, and we wanted to be on our own. We wanted to do something that might be fun, so New York City seemed like a fun place. And I was working at a very, very small operation that Wheelabrator had in Newark. And it didn't take long, about a year and a half, and after we'd kind of had so much fun, I decided, obviously, that Wheelabrator was not going to be my business career. And so I put a resume out on Wall Street. And I had an interesting experience. I was looking for a job in mergers and acquisitions. And so I was at Merrill Lynch, and this guy said to me, he said, I've been interviewing for 2 positions. I've interviewed 50 people. He said, you're the only guy that is not coming from the industry, and he said, I'm offering you one of those positions. He said, and I have to tell you, you'd be a goddamn fool not to accept this offer. At the time, I was, believe this, I was making, this was 1968, 69, I was making $10,000 to $12,000. And this was a position that would start at $25,000. These are real numbers, folks. And he told me if I was successful, in a couple of years I could be making 6 figures. So I thought, boy, this is fantastic. And I really kind of went home at that time, kind of in between jobs. And while I was home, my dad and I got talking, and he said, if you ever wanted to try Sloan Valve Company, this is the time that you got to come. We're not going to just sit around and wait for you to make the decision. This is when you have to come. And he said, my advice would be, give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, you can go back to Wall Street. Wall Street will always be there. Well, right or wrong, and I think the experience would say that it was right, I decided to take him up on that. And so Jane and I went home. Jane had my oldest son in arms, carrying in arms. He was only a couple months old. And I remember driving to work that first day. It was a Monday. We had arrived back on Friday. We were driving to work on Monday. And my dad said to me, he says, I have to tell you, he says, you're not actually going to go to work for Sloan Valve Company. You're going to go work for the rep agency in Chicago. And you're going to have to set it up. We know who your partners are going to be, but you're going to have to incorporate it and all the rest of it. I didn't think anything about that. I just thought it would, great experience out on the street selling the product and going through the experience of incorporation and getting a physical site to have the office and working with new partners and everything else. But then I found out that this decision was just not part of my business development. The reason why I was not coming to work for Sloan Valve Company is because my Uncle Jim Sloan said, I'm not coming to Sloan Valve Company. He slammed his fist on the desk and said, He'll come to Sloan when I say he comes to Sloan. Why? Because I was a threat to the Sloans running the business. My uncle was president, my dad was secretary treasurer, my cousin was in the business, and they looked at me as being a threat to their control of Sloan Valve Company. So you take all those things together, and I just said to myself, one thing, nobody's going to control my business career. I was going to run my own life. I remember at that time, my Grandpa Allen said to me, he said, it's better to sell apples on the street corner than work for somebody else. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but those were the things that were stuck in my head. So shortly after I got the business in 1972, not only am I worrying about, manufacturing and product and electronics, I also decided that I was going to start the process of consolidating ownership. So I had a friend, an older guy who was an attorney in South Bend, Indiana, Jim Thornburg, and I called him up, and we started working on analyzing our shareholder lists and deciding how we could consolidate ownership. We picked out the largest block, which was a block of stock held in trust at the Northern Trust Bank. So we walked down there in Chicago and called on the trust officer that managed this account. And he said, this is interesting. He said, just last week there was another company in here wanting to buy Sloan Valve Company. I couldn't believe this. Think about this. For 2 generations, there's been no consolidation of ownership. WE during his career was giving it away. Second generation never consolidated. We're sitting at 9%, and nobody had tried to consolidate. I go out with this attorney, and the first guy I bump into, he tells me there's somebody else that's trying to buy that stock. Well, the first question was, how the hell did they know about it? Because nobody knew about it, and it was obvious to us that it had to be some director inside the company on our board of directors that had fingered that stock to this other company. And this other company happened to be a company that was in the plumbing business, and the name of that company was Nibco. And they had just relationships that allowed them to finger that stock. So they were trying to come in and take over Sloan Valve Company. It was about 3 weeks after that meeting at the Northern Trust. I was sitting in my office, and I got a phone call from the operator, and she said, Chuck, I have to tell you, there's 2 people here. There's an attorney, and there's somebody from Nibco. And I knew something was wrong. I called my dad, I called my uncle, and we went down, we sat down in the boardroom, and the president of Nibco was sitting across from us, and he reaches in his briefcase, and he says, I suppose you know by now that we bought the stock at the Northern. And he put down a stack of stock certificates that was about like that. So here we are, Sloan and the Allens at 36%, and Nibco was at 25%. The horse race was on. And I would just tell you that the next 2 weeks were the worst 2 weeks of my life. During that period of time, I lost 10 pounds, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, spent all day on the phone talking to our other shareholders, trying to get their support. And of course, at the same time that we're making calls, Nibco was also making these calls. And during the process, one day I remember it was 10 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting with my wife watching television, and the phone rang. And I picked it up, and it was my dad. He didn't say hello or anything. He says, now we're really in trouble. And I'm kind of going like, yeah, what's been going on for the last week and a half? He said, Nibco got on their corporate plane, flew up to Appleton, Wisconsin, and they're in George Buckley being a director of Sloan Valve Company, in his living room, and they're just trying to buy his stock, and they'll just keep raising the prices until he has to give in. I said, how did you find this out? He said, well, his wife is in the bedroom, and she called me. I said, well, call her back and tell her whatever they offer, we will top that bid. My dad said, well, where are we going to get the money? I said, I don't know, but we'll get the money. So we hung up the phone. Remember, 10 o'clock in Chicago. I had a yellow pad by my desk, by my chair, and I just wrote down a list of names of people that I knew had money. And I had come from South Bend, so a couple of my calls went back to South Bend. You got to remember they're an hour ahead of us, so I'm calling back at 11 o'clock at night. I got one guy who was, in the family of the people that, I don't know if you know this company, Associates Investments, but they were big, company in South Bend. And I'm asking him for a couple $1 million to save the company at 11 o'clock at night. I got this mental picture of him standing there in his pajamas. And he said, well, we can talk about that tomorrow and all that kind of stuff. Well, one of the calls I made was to one of our major suppliers who supplied us with all our brass ingot. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll call you back in half an hour. So he called me back in half an hour. He says, we're in. We'll finance whatever you have to do up to $2 million. I realized later, of course, that Nibco, which was also in the plumbing business, did not buy their brass from Kramer. So really what he was doing, amongst other things, he was helping a friend, but he was also protecting his business from going to the competition. It was interesting that I told you about Nibco being up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and what they did do was they kept offering higher prices and higher prices to this guy. He didn't sell out, but we knew that they were offering higher prices. Earlier on, at one point when Nibco first came to Sloan Valve Company, they asked us for the shareholder list, and we told them, we haven't got the time to get you the shareholder list, but we later decided we'd give them the shareholder list, because if they had the shareholder list, they had certain responsibilities to act in a certain legal way relative to that shareholder list. Well, what they did is they put a tender offer out to all the shareholders at a set price. And then remember, they go up to Appleton, Wisconsin, and they offer these various prices. That's against the law. You got poor Aunt Nellie out in Des Moines, Iowa. She doesn't know what's going on, and she gets this price where this guy gets this price. That's a violation of the Williams Act. You can't, if you've got a tender offer out, you can't offer various prices. We took them to court. We shut them down. We got a TRO, temporary restraining order, where they couldn't buy more stock. And during that period of time, we went out and bought shares in the marketplace and got up to over 52% and ultimately forced them out of the business. It was expensive, but I remember that, we finally had peace. We finally had majority control. And I thought, boy, we're on top of this. We got this thing won. And I would just tell you that I later realized that was just the first step in what turned out to be a 40-year crusade to try and control the company. And the next step that we did in this we'll just call it this period of rest after this crisis, was that we decided that we wanted to go out and take out the rest of the small shareholders that we had in place. I mean, they were out there. They were not really part of the long-term strategy. Some of them had been they were still shareholders because they were waiting for a liquidity event that, never had happened and frankly was not going to happen because, I said that I wanted to maintain ownership. Some of them had sentimental attachment to the stock. They could trace their ownership of the stock back to W.E. Sloan. So, they were holding on for various reasons. But we wanted to get them out. And we also had another issue that was on the table. And it was this, that historically, when you thought about the ownership of Sloan Valve Company, you always thought about it as being the Sloans and the Allens. And, so Bill and I were sitting there, and it kind of came to us that that's not the way to look at it. It's really the insiders and the outsiders. It was Bill and I who were the officers of the corporation, and our sisters who were on the outside. Now, we were not paying any dividends at the time. So here are our sisters sitting out here getting no return for basically a 50%. After we took the small shareholders out, 50% of the company. All of this, how to handle this strategy, we didn't know what to do or how to do it. We were operators. And one piece of advice that I think I've heard today is, these financial issues are sophisticated. It's not amateur hour. Find yourself a professional. And it was kind of a serendipity, but this is when Sloan Valve Company ran into Ted Behringer. And Ted brought his team in, and we kind of were talking about the small shareholders, and we were talking about our sisters. And Ted put a plan together that we never could have conceived if it was left up to our own devices. To get the small shareholders out, what Ted proposed was that we put together a reverse stock split. So what we did is for roughly every 45 shares that you had of Sloan Valve Company, we'd give you 1 share of stock. And those numbers were not accidental. They were designed so that all these small shareholders that were in the company got fractional shares. And then we, passed a resolution that no shareholder in Sloan Valve Company could own fractional shares of the company. So, a lot of the people, as I say, were happy with that. Here was an opportunity to cash out, to get some income. There were a few people that had the sentimental attachment to the stock that didn't like it, and I'm sorry about that, but that's just the way that goes. Of course, when we took them out, then the ownership share of my sisters went up. And so then we sat down, we told Penny and Donna that we wanted to get them out. And they got attorneys, and Ted was leading our team, plus corporate attorneys in Chicago. And we sat down and talked about redeeming their stock. But, remember, we had taken out NIBCO and all these other people, so the company was kind of a little heavy in debt. And so, it was a financial burden. And Ted and his team came up with some pretty creative solutions. We put a package together, and obviously there was some cash involved. There was some notes from the company, some debt notes for Penny and Donna that had some attractive interest. But the really creative element of it is, remember, we had this 400,000 square foot plant which we own. So we set up a real estate LLC to own that real estate, and we exchanged some of the LLC shares for the Sloan shares that they had. This, of course, reduced our financial burden for purchasing that. And for Penny and Donna, we then paid them a rental income, which was shielded by depreciation. So here they got this beautiful stream of income. And, it really worked out well. I would certainly admit to you that during the process of negotiation, there were some tough periods of time when, people are angry about, the proposals that the other side was making. But in the final analysis, Penny and Donna were not getting any income, and now they had a nice income stream. And Bill and I were managing the company and had 100% control within the managing group. And I'll just say in general, just in passing, that that's really healthy, because if one thing that can be a difficult process is if you have major shareholders outside the company. They have different interests, and if you don't take care of them, they can really kind of upset the apple cart. And having all that ownership within the operating management was a very healthy thing. I should also say in passing, talking about how this all worked out. One of the early things I said to Ted was, every Christmas I'm invited to the Christmas dinner at my sister's house. And I said, when the end of this is in place, I said, I want to still be invited to the Christmas dinner. And basically, what I was saying was, I want to be fair to Penny and Donna. This is not about trying to steal the business from them. This is being fair. That total process took about 6 years to conclude. So we were talking about how long it takes to get these done. That was a long process. But again, it consolidated 100% of ownership within the Sloan Allen family, and it was owned by the active members of the family. It gave the outside shareholders income. It allowed us to develop an incentive compensation plan to stimulate and reward the top executive team. We also were more easily able to attract key outside management, and it also bought time for us to groom the next generation. It kind of put this ownership issue to bed. At least that's what I thought at that particular time. And during that period of time, Bill and I and Ted sat down and started to, continue this process. As Ted says, this process of planning, strategic planning, goes on and on and on. So during this period of time, Bill and Ted and I got to sit down and talk about the ownership of Bill and I. Where is that going to go? And just to be a little chauvinistic here, Bill had 2 daughters and I had 3 sons.